This is the Education Exchange with Paul Peterson. I am the director of the program on education policy and governance at Harvard University. Thank you for joining us. The United States is experiencing a staggering change in its educational system during the initial decades of the 21st century. For 200 years, there was nothing but unending growth and improvement of our schools, our colleges, everything about our educational system. But as we entered the 21st century, the system crested and turned downwards. And we have seen this at all levels. It gathered speed. The downward trend gathered speed with the onset of the COVID pandemic. Where we're going to go in the future remains to be seen. But Danish Shakeel, Misty, Gallo, and Pat Wolf document that the first 2 decades has seen a major downward drift in our educational system. They present this information in their paper that's part of the Annenberg Working Papers series. It's entitled The Nation's Achievement Inequality Report Card, an assessment of test scores and equality trends in traditional public, charter, Catholic, and Department of Defense schools. There's a lot there. So I'm very pleased to have Danish Shakeel, the lead author, with me on the Education Exchange today. Thank you, Danny, for joining us.
Thanks, Paul.
Well, the authors focus on changes in the gap between the performance of the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or NAEP, at the 90th and 10th percentiles of the test score distribution over the period 2003 to 2022. But the details of the paper also tell us what's happening to a broader segment of the population, those at the 75th and 25th percentile, in these 4 sectors that I have mentioned. So, Danny, there's so much in your paper. I just cannot believe you have assembled so much useful information. And I really advise our listeners to go to your paper to get the full story. But can we begin to pick this apart by talking strictly about the public schools, the traditional public schools, the largest sector, and then we can go on to look at some of these other sectors. So would you tell us how the highest performing students performed in our traditional public schools over this 2-decade period?
Sure, Paul. First, I would like to correct that the duration we cover is from 2005 and until 2024. So it's a 20-year period.
Oh, okay, so it's a little bit different from what I said, 2005 to 24.
Yes,
Got it.
and the reason we begin in 2005 is because that's the first year we have charters at both 4th and 8th grade in NAEP. So we can compare all 4 sectors across these 20 years.
Okay, that sounds good. All right. I don't think that's a big change. I think probably you would get the same thing if you started a little earlier and ended a little earlier, but yeah, it's good to have that clarified. 2005 to 2024. So how did the top 25% of public schools or the top 10% of public school students do over that period of time?
So the 90th percentile score is increasing over time, and we look at both the era prior to COVID and also like the era including COVID. So
But
if
if
you
you
look
look at the entire period, how
at
much of a gain do you get over the entire period for the top 10%?
so for the top 10%, we have about at 4th grade math, we have on average 3.7 NAEP points per decade of growth. Now, if you multiply by 2 for 20 years, it comes out to about 7.4 NAEP points over this period. And I must mention that we are adjusting the gains for the student characteristics for their background, such as ethnicity, gender, special education, English language learner, and so on.
So you've controlled for lots of other things, and you still see that this top 10% improves by quite a bit per decade over this period. So that's sort of a good news story. if you just look at the top 10%, right?
Yes, I mean the growth is a little bit less at grade 8. It's only like zero point 0.3 per decade for math and only zero point 0.7 for reading at grade 8.
And so it's less there than for the elementary school. The grade four, you get the biggest gains, a little less uh, grade grade eight, but still, it's all pretty sharp increase. Now, how about the bottom 10%? What do you get there?
So for the bottom 10%, we get a reduction actually, and the reduction is a decline of 3.3 points per decade for math at grade 4 per decade, and 4.6 points per decade reduction in reading at grade 4. And similarly, we have declines of 5.6 points per decade for eighth grade math and 4.5 points per decade for eighth grade reading.
Right, right. So if you look at the gap then between the top 10% and the bottom 10%, it's going to have to widen given that the fact that the top 10%'s improving and the bottom 10%'s not. So what do you get for that?
I mean, the gap is definitely growing. So we see a growing gap chiefly because the 10% pattern is declining, and we see that inequality is increasing in this sector overall. We don't see any closing of the gaps in any grade in any subject.
No, people have noticed this before, but they have said it's driven mainly by COVID. So do you find that? Is this mainly a story of COVID, or is this something that's broader than that?
No, it's not chiefly a COVID story. COVID indeed worsened things, but the decline remains if we look at the period prior to COVID. So if you look at the period prior to COVID, we see a decline in the scores at the 10th percentile for fourth grade reading and also for eighth grade math and reading. For fourth grade math, we see an increase of only zero point 0.1 point, 0.1 point per decade in those scores. So it's a negligible increase. At least it's a stable pattern for fourth grade math.
So let me ask you, some people say that your focus here on the top 10% and the bottom 10%. I know others have done that. Sean Reardon did that in his initial study. I was very critical of his original study for doing that because I said, well, you're just focusing on extreme cases here, and they may not tell you what's basically happening more typically. But you've been very thoughtful here because you also give us information for the top quarter, the top 25% and the bottom 25%. Now, that's a little broader cut. So, what's the storyline that you get for this broader cut of students that may be more reliable information as some people think?
I mean the pattern. If you look at the quarter and the bottom and the top categories, is the same as the 10th percentile in top and bottom. We see some moderations in some cases, but overall the story is not changed. We do see the gaps increasing even at those quarters.
Well, yes, I see that, but if I look into it, I see they're not as increasing by as dramatically. I think I
Yes,
I get increases of about 3 points per decade in the elementary school and about 1 to 2 points in math and reading in the eighth grade. So the
yes,
gaps are definitely increasing. You're absolutely right, but it's a little bit more, not quite as dramatic as it
exactly.
is.
The pattern is moderated at those quartiles.
So, and then that does also show, what does that show before COVID? Are you getting for these the 25, 75 thing? Are you getting still a lot of increase before COVID?
The COVID worsened the pattern, but the decline in the 10th percentile and the increase in the gaps overall is there, even at the quartiles.
Yeah,
But
that's
they are,
yeah, especially at the elementary level.
yeah.
And so this is a concerning. Why do you think this has happened?
Uh, well, we can only speculate because COVID alone cannot explain these patterns, and neither can the theory of smartphone and accountability explain these patterns. If we look at the scores over time, we don't see any single explanation. I think there's a huge challenge in the traditional public school sectors about educating the low achievers, and there's a struggle going on. I think we need interventions of various kinds to address this situation that has been ongoing for a while.
Well, some
Uh,
people say it's because the more able students are leaving your traditional public schools for the charter sector or the private sector or the Catholic sector. So, is there a migration away from your traditional public schools and leaving the children behind? As they say, that the public school children are being left behind with all this. Is it just a story of migration away from the public schools?
I mean, if we look at the patterns by geography, so let's say we look at the urban and rural pattern, we see the decline is also happening in rural areas where school choice is less prevalent. So I am less willing to buy that migration is the sole argument for decline in the public sector students at 10 percentile or the quarter percentile.
Yeah, but how about your suburban areas? The suburban area exempt from this pattern?
Now we see that the pattern holds across all four geographies, suburban, town, rural, and cities.
So you don't see that so if you were to talk about our suburban communities in a lot of middle class America lives in those suburban communities, would you say that they feel like, oh, this doesn't apply to us? You're talking about inner city schools or you're talking about rural America, but this doesn't apply to us. Our schools are okay. You wouldn't buy that?
No, we don't see that pattern, Paul. We see that this decline it holds in all the subgroups. We actually like have approximately 1,000 comparisons across sector, grade, subject, and different subgroups in NAEP. So we see that mostly these patterns hold.
Well, one of the things that stands out in this for me is that the charter sector story is quite different. So if we shift to the charter sector, we keep our eye on this 75-25 gap, which is the one that really, I think, is telling a big, important story. When I look at the charter school, I see a closing of the gap. It's not a lot, but it moving in the right direction. And you're seeing positive gains by the bottom 25%, and you're seeing positive gains by the top 75%. So everybody's making gains, and the biggest gains are being made by those in the lowest quarter of the distribution. So
Yes.
shouldn't charter schools be celebrating your data set?
So, Paul, there are two metrics we focus on. One is the improvement metric, and one is the equality metric. So we define if the gains are of the magnitude of about 2 points per decade, which accounts to about a fifth year of learning, then we say that they're significant. Now, if we use that metric, the improvement does not appear to be much in charters as well. But on the equality metric, definitely the bottom percentile is increasing at least equally or more than the top percentile. So the inequality is decreasing. So their charters definitely have an edge.
Well, but the charter schools are improving by 5 points per decade in math at the fourth grade level and 6.5 points per decade at the eighth grade level. So that's pretty good, isn't it?
But you are looking at the period prior to COVID. I was referring to the entire period.
I see. So okay. So So this COVID story becomes important when you look at what happens during the COVID period. It really there's a huge negative impact on the charter sector
Exactly.
of the
Yeah.
COVID. Why is that? What happened to charter schools during COVID?
I mean, charter schools are public schools, so they are required to abide by the law. And except for private schools, most public schools were closed. And I think it also applies to many charters. So the school closures affected the charter schools more in like a worse fashion as compared to their district counterparts. It appears to be so from these graphs.
Well, that could be, and it could also be that charter schools are located in parts of the country where school closures were especially long and
Yeah.
serious because a lot of charter schools are located on the East Coast and the West Coast, and those parts of the country, governors were especially uh, ready to shut down the school system. So maybe it was just they were really hit by these gubernatorial decisions to close school. Is that possible?
That's surely possible, Paul. I think maybe if we can track the school closures by sector, that might be what was going on that time.
Right. So do you do anything by region in your analysis? I know you do it by rural, but do you do it or urban or suburban, but do you do it by different regions of the country?
We did that, Paul, but it's somewhere lying on my computer. We did not report that just because if we do it by region, we were not expecting much observations for the defense schools and the Catholic schools, so we did not report them.
All right. Well, there might be a story in there to dig out, but you can't cover everything in this one paper. I mean, you've covered so much already. It's amazing, truly amazing. So let's talk about the Catholic schools. What's the what's the story with the Catholic schools, would you say? What's the takeaway?
So the Catholic schools behave somewhat like the public school sector when we look at the top and bottom 10th percentile, of course. But even if we look at the top and bottom quarter percentiles, we see an increase in the gap both prior to COVID and post-COVID, at least at the grade 4. But if you look at grade 8, prior to COVID, we don't see much increase in gap, but post-COVID, we definitely see an increase, especially in math at grade 8. So the Catholic sector seems to have the same issues as the traditional public school sectors.
Now, is this possible that, the Catholic sector has changed a lot over this period of time? It's steadily shrunk. And maybe it shrunk because of the fact that it hasn't been improving, but maybe it hasn't been improving because a lot of students are going maybe to charter schools or some other or to private schools that are not Catholic. Could it be losing some of its higher performing students?
That's certainly possible, Paul. And there are some broader social, technological, and family level changes that are affecting the sector as well. And also the demographic of the charter attendee, sorry, Catholic attendees has been changing over time. So all of those things together might be causing this pattern that we're observing.
Yes, for one thing, that you now in some states can get a tax credit scholarship, or you can get a voucher, or you can get an education savings account to help pay your way to a Catholic school. So that might attract, especially if you're of low income, so that might attract a different clientele to the Catholic sector than one that relied on people being able to pay their way as in the past.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. So maybe we want to be cautious in our interpretation of the Catholic data, especially probably because of these changes. Now, the most interesting thing, perhaps for some people, is your analysis of the Defense Department. very few people know that there's a sizable segment of young people who actually go to schools run by the U.S. Department of Defense. I thought mainly the Department of Defense was supposed to shoot guns, but you're telling me no, they're educating people. So how many students are actually going to school and institutions run by the Department of Defense?
I mean, it's mostly military families, so they cater to their needs. They are positioned both on the U.S. mainland and abroad, wherever there are families serving the U.S. military. And this school is a sizable sector. Of course, it's like as not as big as Catholic Charter and the TPS sector. I don't have like the number top of my head, but it's quite big, but not definitely comparable in size to Catholic and Charter sector.
Well, what's
Uh,
interesting about it, I mean, took a look at your data, and you actually it says it's less than 1% of all students in the United
yeah.
States. So we're talking about a small number of students relative to everybody else. But the Defense Department fully participates in NAEP, and every student who's, I think, or I don't know exactly, but I do know this, that the numbers of students in your sample from that are in the Defense Department sample is very large. It's much larger than you would think, given the fact that it's a fairly small segment of the population. Uh, do you agree with that?
Yeah, we report those numbers in the appendix. So yeah, so I agree with you on that.
Yeah, yeah. So that appendix was very interesting. And so now, having said that, what's really interesting is that we see sizable gains in every decade. Whether we're talking about before COVID or after COVID, we're seeing sizable gains for both the bottom and the top students in the distribution. I'm looking at the 75-25 data here on my screen, and I see, across the board gains for everybody.
Yeah, Paul, and especially there are some cases where the 10 percentile has like an edge over the top percentile. So, and even at 75-25, you see at least one case for grade 4 math and also for grade 8 math, where the bottom quartile has a larger growth than the top quarter. So
Yeah.
this sector is very interesting.
So, do you have any thoughts as to why? What's so wonderful about the schools run by the Defense Department?
So we can only speculate, Paul. The sector definitely has military personnel overseeing a lot of policies, not just the teachers. And I would speculate it's a discipline of the military and the institutions that are from which they draw the teacher pool and their policies. So I think discipline probably is the reason to explain all these patterns that we observe, and it is the only sector that from where we see improvement in most of the comparisons which we do.
Now, is it possible that the military has become more selective, and so it's harder to become a member of the armed forces today than it was 25 years ago, and therefore they just have higher quality families today and higher quality home support and higher quality student capacity in the Defense Department than ever before?
It is certainly possible that the sector is drawing better teachers than before, or maybe is putting more resources on their training and discipline policies, and maybe the families are also getting a lot of support there. Now, these things can be established by some hard research, which I don't have access to, and there's not much on these schools, to be honest. When we looked at the studies done on these defense schools, there's not much out there, Paul. So all of those things are definitely possible, but it's not easy to establish those theories without data.
Well, maybe we can find some clues there to what is the way to turn our educational system around, because the basic story you're telling here for most students who are attending our traditional public schools is that the 21st century has not been a great time for American education. That's the conclusion I reach, but maybe you reach a different conclusion. How would you interpret your overall findings?
I agree with you that overall the story is not very good. However, you see that in the charter sector, we see some promises of equality. In the defense sector, we see some cases of equality and also improvement. So, although we don't have data to suggest what I'm going to say, but I do think the a model which combines some practices of charters and the defense schools, or I would say some charter schools run by the defense department, would be an interesting thing to look into as we go forward. Now, I did look into whether the defense department runs some charter schools. So there are a few, but I don't have any access to that information in my NIP data to look at whether the charters run by defense are doing better than the other schools.
Well, thank you very much, Danny, for laying all this out. And thank you and your colleagues for writing an exceptionally fascinating paper. And thank you for joining me on the Education Exchange.
Thank you very much, Paul.
I've been speaking with Danish Shakeel of the University of Buckingham in just north of London. He's the lead author of a just released paper on the Annenberg Working Papers website entitled The Nation's Achievement Inequality Report. I am Paul Peterson. This is the Education Exchange. Please join me for a new Education Exchange podcast released on the Education X website every Monday at noon Eastern Time.